Yes. Yes, we can see it.
All right, excellent. We'll just keep it, minimized like that. So let's move right to a little bit about today's talk. So as an overview, I like to set expectations at the beginning of any talks that I give, and this is an enormous field that you're asking me to talk about. Knowing that, we should probably limit our scope to what I know best, which is human spaceflight. In particular, long-term human spaceflight on space stations. And while this is our focus, there are a lot of folks working on cool problems like astrobiology, so how life might evolve on other planets, astrogeology, so the geology of other planets, astronomy generally, what other worlds, stars, and galaxies are made of and what they might look like. Some of these people are my best friends, so naturally I've learned a thing or two, and while I'm not a scientist, I can at least give some context on where to start asking your own questions if you're interested. While I am an economist by training, most of what I think about is technology and how it relates to keeping people alive and well while they're up in space, while they're staying there, and while they will potentially someday live on other planets. At the end of the day, though, I'm an expert really on markets. So that's where you'll get the most out of my time, out of me. Basically, we can't keep paying inordinate sums of money to take joyrides on orbit. If we're going to go up and go up to stay, we need good reasons to go. Improving life on Earth and making money seem to be the best ones right now, and that's what I'm focused on. And finally, I hope to do a little bit of myth busting in this talk. So if you don't know how rockets work, please ask. Seriously, it's confusing and counterintuitive sometimes. We're on Earth. If you don't know why we're lighter on Mars than we are on Earth, ask. Like seriously, so long as we can meet in the field of genuine curiosity, we are totally good. I hate PowerPoints. So the more you interrupt, if you want to interrupt, the better. If there's an hand raise feature and you want to use that, that's great. But I'm ready to get started if you are, so away we go. Let's start with what the heck is out there? What better place to get started, right? In short, space and a lot of it. The space between stars is absolutely mind-blowingly enormous. The numbers are so large that it kind of stops making sense and gets a little comical at times. Mars is about 35 million miles away when it's closest to us, and it's going. If you were going, let's say 100 miles an hour nonstop, your car would take about 40 years to get there driving day and night, right? Of course, you die a fast and very painful death the second you left Earth's atmosphere in your car, but that's another story. And that's just Mars. Mars is our second closest neighbor after Venus. And that's when it's closest to us, when it's on the other side of the sun, because remember, everything's always in motion in space. Orbits are constantly moving. It's 250 million miles away. So that's pretty insane. Now Pluto is 3.3 billion miles away. And that's just the billions, right? We can still imagine these numbers. There are about 7 billion people on Earth. So 3.3 billion is about half of that, right? But that's our solar system. That doesn't even get into the nearest star. And you see a lot of stars in the night sky, right? So how close is the nearest star? That would be Alpha Centauri. And Alpha Centauri is 4.35 light years away. And a light year is, you guessed it, the distance that light travels in 1 year. And it travels at about 190,000 miles per second. And in a year, that means that light travels about, like, give or take 6 trillion miles. So Alpha Centauri is about 26 trillion miles away. So I guess if you have about like 6.8 million years to spare driving 100 miles an hour all day long, and a car that could keep you alive while you're in space, you could get there. And that is literally as close as it gets. Now take a look at the picture on the top left. That's called the Hubble Deep Field, and it was taken by the famous Hubble Space Telescope in 1995 across a part of the sky about the size of your pinky nail, held out at full length. What you're looking at on the left is about 1/10 of the total image. Those little dots aren't stars, if you're wondering. Scientists pointed it at what appeared to be a totally blank patch of sky, and they discovered millions, billions of galaxies, whole galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars in them, all of them millions and billions of light years away from Earth. So yeah, I mean, I would maybe rethink about exploring the whole universe right now. It's a little big, and there is a lot of stuff out there, even though the spaces between those galaxies are so large. A trillion galaxies, 100 billion trillion stars, potentially planets circling each of those stars very far away. And so in all probability, if you can dream it, it is out there somewhere. It really exists. And that's the thing about space, right? I guess sometimes the way I like to think about it when people ask me what's out there is saying to them, well, you know, everything else, everything that has ever existed and will ever exist that is not Earth. That is what's out there. And yet this planet is all we know. And that's because it's our home, and that is very important. We'll talk about that a little more later. And what you're looking at on the bottom left is a real picture. All these pictures are real. That is a beautiful sunset on a clear day on Mars. That planet mashup you see on the right is two of Saturn's moons. On the left is Enceladus with its ice cover and liquid oceans underneath, and Titan on the right with its thick atmosphere and lakes of liquid methane on the surface. Both are actually really good candidates for hosting new forms of life, and we are looking to explore those planets in the near future. But that's just our solar system, right? If we can find 3 candidates for life, I'm including Mars on the far left again, then imagine what else could be out there among those billions of trillions of stars. Really makes you think and wonder. But hey, we're here to talk about people. We're not here to talk about aliens. I work on people things, not alien things, I promise. And we've got a lot of problems to solve on this planet. So let's talk a little bit more about that and limit our thinking to the solar system for now. I'm going to move on. So let's talk about how we get there. Obviously, how do we get to space? Since my driving analogy, you might be a little bit discouraged in trying to travel in space, but I assure you it's been done. It is very possible. While it won't be fast, getting to the moon or Mars or beyond, it can be done with chemical rockets. The truth is, we've been doing the same thing for a very long time, since before the time of Apollo. And on the left, you see the Saturn V rocket that took humans to the moon 50 years ago. I just find it insane sometimes. The fact that just like we make heat to boil water to spin generators and make power, we still, in most cases, refine rotten dinosaur bones into rocket propellant to go to space. That is a true fact. A rocket propellant one, RP1, is a highly efficient, highly refined form of kerosene. In many cases, we use liquid hydrogen and oxygen, which are also super energy efficient. But the problem is they need to be kept super cool, which takes a lot of energy. And that means they can't be stored for long periods of time because they need to be kept so cold. We don't have nuclear rockets. We certainly don't have solar power rockets. So almost no matter how you launch, you are using a chemical rocket. There are other ideas out there, like a giant centrifuge to hurl rockets through the atmosphere, which I'm happy to talk about if you want. But for now, this is what we're doing. And we're doing it because of something called the rocket equation. Basically, it's really hard to escape Earth and get into orbit. Our atmosphere is super thick. And the more you take with you, the more fuel you have to take to propel yourself. The heavier you get because of the fuel, the more engines you have to add, the more fuel you have to take. There are no gas stations in space, so you have to take everything with you. That's why you see rockets doing what's called staging, or dropping off parts of themselves as they get higher and use up their fuel. They're shedding weight, so they have to use less fuel and they can go faster. So to review, getting through the atmosphere is stupidly hard. Earth's gravity is really strong. This is I really want to emphasize, this is the core problem of most of space flight. Beyond that, most of what's keeping us tied down to the planet is 60 or so miles above your head right now. It shakes us on the way up, that atmosphere. It makes our structures that we launch need to be extremely strong. You can't have fine lattice work, no fragile glass windows, just extremely durable tin cans. That is pretty much everything we can send right now. It limits the size of our spaceships. Our atmosphere and our gravity also limits the directions in which we can launch our rockets. And it causes a lot of other risks besides. And as dumb as it sounds to use this method, it really is the best thing we got. And so let's talk about, I'm sure a lot of you are curious about the impact of that. Now, barring reactions of hydrogen and oxygen, which, as I said before, are the most chemically efficient that we can get the most push from, let's focus on those that use rocket propellant, fossil fuel derivative. Let's make a comparison to something we all know and have probably done, airplane flight. So in 2018, there were 114 rocket launches. I have to look at my notes here, sorry. 38 million flights all over the world. At this rate, the airline industry alone emits about 40,300 times more carbon dioxide than accessing space with rockets. So that's about 918 million tons of CO2 versus about 23,000 tons of CO2. Put in a global context, the CO2 output of all of spaceflight, all of it in one of space's busiest years, 2018, accounts for about 0.0000059% of total global CO2 emissions. So just for comparison, so we're clear about where the real villains of global CO2 emissions are. 30 minutes of using a super inefficient leaf blower, like a normal leaf blower, they're terribly inefficient, will put more CO2 into the atmosphere than a trip from Portland, Maine to Miami, Florida in a Ford F-150. So if we're going to talk about emissions, let's get real, right? There are probably more direct wins than totally hampering exploration of the solar system because we noticed rocket launches more than leaf blowers, right? So that's a little bit about how we get there. But let's talk about and the impacts, obviously, of how we get there, so we can be good stewards. But let's talk about how we stay there, because that's really where the meat of what I do lies. So in a word, it takes space stations, and space stations are definitely not like anything you've ever stayed in on Earth, unless you've stayed in a closet for months at a time. They're not the Space Hilton you see on the far top left from the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. What you see in the middle is more like it in terms of getting there in a space capsule. That happens to be 3 astronauts tucked into a Russian Soyuz on its way up to the International Space Station, or the ISS. And they're tucked in that space for hours, if not days, at a time. That picture on the right is 2 astronauts inside one of the largest spaces inside the International Space Station. Notice all of the computers and science equipment on the walls dedicated to keeping those astronauts alive, and by the way, extremely busy. It is hard work staying alive, and you got to maintain the equipment very carefully. The ISS today is in orbit. You can see it going over your head on some clear nights, and 6 people have lived up there pretty constantly since the year 2001. Not the same 6, but obviously in rotating shifts. It orbits at about 11,000 miles per hour, which is about 3 miles per second. So that gets you across the entire United States in about 15 minutes, by the way. So it's going very fast. It's a very good thing that there is almost no air, no atmosphere up there to cause friction and to heat the thing to a boil, or else everyone would die very quickly. And they're still alive because there is no atmosphere. Atmosphere is the problem, remember. But back to the topic of staying there. I'm just talking about space stations for now, and one particular space station stuck in one very specific orbit. The truth about life in space is that we humans have evolved in the most miraculous place, in perfect balance with it. Our bodies making perfect use of all of the conditions available to us: oxygen, water, temperature, air pressure. We were perfectly adapted to live in exactly our environment and absolutely none other. Throw that off balance just a little bit and boom, you're dead. You are dead. Any lack or excess of those things, we boil, we freeze, we starve, or we asphyxiate. So we have to live in these tin cans called space stations, where we can control that environment to an extremely high degree of precision using thousands of machines that work in perfect unison to keep humidity, pressure, oxygen ratios, and the toilets working in perfect order. And in spite of our best efforts, these systems are not perfect. Entropy will always win, and we don't have the benefit of trees and an entire very fragile ecosystem to work at recycling CO2 into oxygen, at regenerating all of the waste into fertilizer, and at providing us food from the land underneath our feet. We have to maintain these instruments with great effort at great expense. We are figuring out ways to do it better, but for now, this is the best we got. As I said, it ain't Hilton. Point is, every system is what's known as a critical failure point, meaning nothing can go wrong, meaning we have to work super hard to maintain it, meaning it's really hard to stay. What you see on the bottom left is astronauts doing a spacewalk to repair a damaged solar panel structural mechanism. What you see on the bottom right is a map of the space station with a very, very, very basic list of where all of the critical life support systems are located. It is a highly complex machine. Repairing sensitive machinery in tight spaces while doing highly complicated maneuvers isn't the only problem, though. Believe it or not. So let's talk about some of the more non-technical issues surrounding space travel, some of the things I really deal with on a daily basis. So what are today's main challenges then? First off, I'll say going to space is what you call a multi-dimensional problem. That means if we don't want the government to be paying billions of dollars for a space station forever, we have to start dividing up that huge problem of how and why we stay there into its associated individual problems. Of course, we've already talked about how hard it is to get there. We know some of the problems are technical. A lot of the problems are technical, obviously. But some of them are a little more nuanced. Let's start with one of the most obvious questions in today's context, where space flight is super expensive. What's the point of going, and why is it worth all of the expense? We need to make the trip worth it. And newsflash, sorry, it's not going to be billionaire tourists that do that for the rest of us. We can all talk about how a few people lowering the cost of space flight. For the rest of us, like the first cars were only for the ultra wealthy before industry achieved scale. I'm happy to talk about that, but we're talking about vastly different scales here, problems at very different scales. That's the first problem with the argument about starting with tourism. I wish I didn't have to spend so much time sometimes discussing tourism, but honestly, I just, being honest with y'all for a moment, it's sucking up a lot of oxygen in the room of the discourse in today's space industry, given how much attention it gets in the world. So here we are. We have to talk about why we go, really, and judiciously. The point is, there just aren't enough billionaires and millionaires who want to do this stuff and then do it many times at that to sustain industry through the period it needs to scale up supply and lower cost of transportation and accommodation. So how we get there and how we stay there. The Venn diagram of people with the means, the desire, and then the capability to go multiple times is really, really tiny. So we need good reasons to go. Other than that, you might think, okay, people are expensive, and so we should send robots, right? Unfortunately, newsflash, machines are also hard, and sending them up to space to do the work of humans doesn't necessarily make it cheaper all the time. Contrary to popular belief, we haven't quite reached Terminator levels yet, though I don't know if you guys have seen those Boston Dynamics robot dog looking things. Those are pretty creepy, but that's still not going to help us in space. If you haven't looked it up, by the way, those things dancing, you 100% should. It's fascinating. Anyway, the point is robots in space are especially hard and incredibly complex. That translates into expense. Take the Canadarm on the top right, for instance. That's the space station's current robotic arm, used for everything from repairing the station to catching cargo containers being flung up and docking them to the airlocks of the space station so the astronauts can eat. That single piece of engineering cost approximately $2 billion. And while we're finding ways to make them cheaper, the really capable space robots still cost the dozens to the hundreds of millions of dollars. So today's biggest challenge by far is expense. And if the government won't pay for it, that's okay. If billionaires will only pay for what they want, which sometimes, sorry to say, doesn't quite coincide with what the best possible path for all of us is, though we have to admit sometimes the tech does have extraordinary benefits, like SpaceX's Falcon 9, making spaceflight cheaper. But if they won't pay for what we really need, who will? And so the short answer to that is again, we need to make it useful for everybody. We need to make the trip worth it, and giving people a good reason to go. We need to think about how to do that. The reason, the reasons might include that life is better up there, and we've discussed why it's not necessarily, or that there's some opportunity in space that doesn't exist on Earth. But barring those, people won't go and stay just because it's cool. So we need to do things in space that we can't do on Earth, right? And these things fall into a few broad categories. There are definitely more that should be described, but let's talk about these first categories. Number one, why do we go? Astronautics. So basically sending people up with the ability to pay to space. While these won't necessarily be tourists, we can be nearly certain that they will be professional astronauts from other nations. Nations will have both the ability to pay and the interest in pushing their national science agendas and programs forward. We can essentially help nations push forward their educational, STEM scientific endeavor without needing to go through the expense of building an entire space platform. So that's one reason why I, as an investor, as an economist, would invest in space. Number two, research and development programs. So what many nations are already doing on the International Space Station today, we know there's a market for science, and every time we engage in basic research about the way our universe works, we are rewarded. The really big discoveries happen when we ask fundamental questions. Why does electricity conduct? What are the basic components of matter? How do we land a rover on the moon? So we don't just do science in space to make money. We do science in space because it pushes the boundaries of the possible, and that usually comes with important ramifications for life on Earth. You're welcome, by the way, for all of those cell phones, right? That is a space technology. I'll get into why a little bit later. The next point that I want to make is really interesting, and it kind of verges on science fiction. So I urge you to look at it skeptically when companies say it's the next $1 trillion economy. Again, these problems are a lot harder than they're being sold a lot of the time. One of the things that I'm really interested in, one of those sci-fi problems is called in situ resource utilization, or space mining, or resource extraction from other planetary bodies, so we don't have to do it here on Earth. Basically, it refers to using what we have where we have it. In the case of extraction, it refers obviously to finding new resources that we can't find here or are super rare. One minor problem with this hypothetical reason to go, even if we do find an asteroid with all the platinum and gold and rare earth minerals we could ever want, it is exceptionally difficult to bring it back to Earth. And if we did, there goes the price of both platinum and gold. Supply and demand, you have way more than you need, the price goes down. So though these materials do have enormously useful applications in everything from microelectronics to catalytic converters and gas-powered cars, we got to be judicious when we talk about this stuff. So basically, ISRU and resource extraction try to answer to the main challenge of getting to space today by creating a drive for people to go. If we think there's value out there, we'll seek it out. But again, we have to be smart when we do. And finally, there's something called in-space manufacturing. I used to work in that field. The picture you see on the far left is something called ZBLAN. It's an acronym that none of us will ever remember. It's a chemical compound, but essentially it's a pure form of optical fiber that can transmit data at much higher rates than today's optical fiber. To make fiber, you basically have to heat up a large block of glass until it just about melts and then pull out a little thread, not much wider than a human hair, to an incredible length. On the right of that picture, you see a thread pulled like this on Earth. And you can see all those little air bubbles and impurities forming. So in space, you get super pure fiber, which helps us move data a lot faster and more securely. And for some context for you, as you might know, optical fiber needs to cross entire continents and sometimes entire oceans to get data from point A to point B. That means we'd have to pull a lot of it in space. You measure how much you buy in miles and hundreds of miles of that. A single fiber is usually about 1/3 of a millimeter. A mile of this stuff weighs a tiny fraction of a pound. And while fiber optics on Earth cost a few $100 for this length, which is pretty expensive, a pound of this ZBLAN stuff made on orbit could cost as much as $30 million, given the value of high accuracy data transmission. But bear in mind, that includes the cost of getting it to space, getting it back. But like, wow, I mean, if we could make something like that work, yes, there's a reason to go to space. But the economics have to work. So somebody has to be there to buy the product at that insane price. And we haven't found those buyers, so we haven't built the stuff. We haven't invested in it. So it's a multi-dimensional problem, remember. But let's get back to the fact that this is really expensive. And remember, it's not just like two people in their mom's garage coming up with a cool app or soldering together a motherboard and programming an OS that turns into a $1 trillion company. This stuff is super capital intensive. You have to build the rockets, you have to build the space station, and guess what? If it doesn't work on the first try, you've just burned millions, sometimes billions of dollars. The James Webb Space Telescope, the space telescope that just went up, maybe some of you heard about it, cost $12 billion over the course of 20 years. Think about it. I mean, I'm very glad it's going. And the science that we'll get is invaluable to understanding our place in the universe. But as much as folks in the industry like to say we're at the dawn of a new space age, they often forget to mention how high the price of error is. Until we get that price down with simpler, cheaper, more reliable technologies, it'll still be hard. We'll still need very good reasons to go. The problem in space is like nothing can go wrong. One thing blows up, people die, missions end. If a tire blows on your car, you can pull over. Not so in space. Maybe robots would seem easier, but think about it. There's no second chances. If something goes wrong, we don't have the technology yet to fix that robot or send up an astronaut to, mess with it yet. I mean, we did a little bit with the space shuttle, but space shuttle's been retired since 2011. So these are really important questions. All this goes to say our economic system is actually super poorly equipped to solve this kind of problem because investors and people have comically short attention spans. That's how they're incentivized. If you put money into something, you want to make sure you take out more than you put in as soon as possible, right? That's normal. And that's the final and most important challenge. At the end of the day, time horizons. That basically means how far ahead we look when we invest. How soon do we expect to get our money back? If you buy a house on a fixed interest 30-year mortgage, your time horizon for that investment is generally speaking about 30 years, making it like typically the longest term investment most people ever make. And they expect to get their money back with a pretty penny on top, right? If you've already started saving for your kids' college fund, congratulations. It's a very long time horizon investment and actually pretty unique behavior, like in college and grad school and university. More to the point, you're investing in yourselves now, right? You're getting an education, you're part of an educational institution, going to that institution and expecting a better salary on the other end of it because you're growing the number of jobs you'll be able to apply for on the other side. And as well as growing your potential future salary. That is an investment with a long time horizon. And in spite of all the academic pain along the way, you expect a reward, right? Or especially because of all the academic pain, I should say. The thing is, though, when we make civilization scale investments that take decades to complete, our governments have been notoriously bad at conveying the importance of that investment to the people they serve. Take a look at the Transcontinental Railroad on the bottom. It's not like the rail companies came together and decided, hey, let's pull all our money and build a rail network across country. They didn't pull all their money. That's not how it happened. It was the 1862 Pacific Railroad Act that chartered Union and Central Pacific Railroads to build it. The government incentivized competition of a massive investment by building in rewards, $48,000 in government bonds for every mile of track built, and 12,800 acres of land for every mile of track built. It also incentivized the companies to compete against each other. Whoever built more would get more. The same goes for highways. It is not as if transcontinental truckers got their investors together one day and decided, hey, let's get oranges from California to New York in 3 days. That would be absurd. It would be a terrible investment, and you can't coordinate collective action on that scale independently. That's why we have government to do it. That's why it takes a village. Without that level of investment in critical economic infrastructure, the business case for these projects, these massive projects with these massive rewards that we all benefit from, begins to break down. The investment case breaks down. And because the time horizons for return on these investments are so hard to define, after all, how do you define how much economic value is generated by the massive investment in highways? Entities and investors acting independently tend not to make these investments. So we're caught in a really tight spot. And right now, I think it's a good time, again, for a reality check. We've established that the economics of this whole situation is a pretty tough nut to crack. If you haven't noticed, you're getting a lot of that from me today, and you're going to keep hearing over and over how this is one of the hardest things that humans can do, and yet somehow we keep doing it. Hopefully asking yourself, why is that, will yield some good answers, and hopefully I convince you in part that it is worth doing. But as usual, before making a judgment, you really need the full story. And again, a big part of that full story involves the technical side. And of course, my hope is that by the end of this conversation, you'll be able to cut through a lot of noise. So let's dive into some of the big questions and expand on what we've learned so far. As you recall, the hard realities of this industry can be described in 3 short phrases. Number 1, getting there is hard. Number 2, staying there is harder. And number 3, it's going to be really friggin' expensive. On the idea of getting there, we talked about chemical rockets, and the sad truth is we don't have warp drives as much as people love Star Trek. It ain't happening. What you see on the left is actually a mathematical model for what a warp drive might look like. NASA did some low-level research into the concept of being shown as a possibility in a paper by a scientist with the last name of Alcubierre. So the drive is also known as the Alcubierre drive. It could take us to apparent speeds above the speed of light, not by breaking the speed of light itself, that's a physical impossibility, but by warping space-time around a spacecraft. Sadly, the warping would require more energy than exists in the entire galaxy, in the entire universe, as well as something called negative energy. Negative energy, sadly, does not exist. Few papers have come out recently showing a much lower energy requirement using only known forms of matter, but still, I advise you to bark up another tree of technologies we're likely to see in our lifetime. For now, we're stuck with the humble Hohmann transfer, which you see on the right of the Alcubierre drive picture. It describes what amounts to a ballistic trajectory between 2 planets at a certain period. Remember, being close to Mars isn't necessarily relevant here, since things are always in motion in space. It's not where something is relative to you at the moment of departure. It is where it's going to be when you arrive, sometimes many months later. So Hohmann transfer is basically a fancy way of saying you throw something really fast at just the right time when the planets are closest, at just the right angle, at just the right speed to minimize the energy required to throw the thing. We already talked a little bit about the rocket equation. And you already know that the more you have to take with you, the more fuel you have to take with you, the more fuel you have to take with you, the more fuel you have to take with you, and so on. So minimizing the fuel consumption for the ride is absolutely critical, pretty much the number one concern. And that means we have to just go a lot slower than we'd like, and trips can take longer than we'd like. In effect, we're stuck until we can build up the infrastructure and the technologies like warp drive required to go faster. Now, on the idea of staying there, I want to leave you with the knowledge that the picture on the far right is a NASA astronaut holding a toilet. I will leave it to your imagination to think of how that mechanism works. But remember that in microgravity, everything floats. And when it comes to toilets, you really don't want that. So we can leave it at that. Being in space isn't what anyone would call pleasant today. It is dangerous, it's technically complex, and the toilets are basically very intimate vacuum cleaners. We need to be realistic about where we're at and how much progress we have yet to make. I haven't even gotten into the physical toll that being in microgravity takes on the human body, but maybe we can leave that for the Q&A if you want. And finally, we know that it's going to take a lot of money. I just really want to get of all the billionaire tourist conversation I'm sure is out there. You see on the bottom left, 2 photos of tourist vehicles, the Virgin Spaceship One and the Blue Origin New Glenn. It's fine. I'm glad folks are going up, but I don't want to leave any of you with the impression that this is going to change the world. I mean, sure, you can make arguments about people seeing how special and boundaryless the Earth is from above, but let's be honest, you can get that from a plane. The truth is that tourism for the ultra wealthy isn't really going to lower the price of getting to space for the rest of us anytime soon. For that, as we discussed, we need to grow utilization and sustained investment with long time horizons, and we need visionary leadership. So we are left with the question of why explore? With all of the information I've given you, with everything you know now about how hard and dangerous it is, how much it costs, and how we're not actually as far along as you might think, the big question is why? And it's an important question. I guess you could answer it in a couple of ways, and space people always do. Oh, you know, we could talk about life in the universe and finding out who we are and learning more about the big questions, about feeling close to the beauty of the infinite, and that's fine. But we have big problems in the world that we are actually living on right now. And last I checked, this Earth of ours is a pretty dependable life support system. Basically, all we have to do is to keep the oxygen flowing and the water on and not mess it up. That's all we have to do to stay alive, to keep every environmental control and life support system we have working. As you know, that's in contrast to space, where basically you have to maintain your carbon dioxide scrubbers on a daily basis, or else, boom, you're dead. Sadly, it seems like we can't have nice things even here on Earth, but that's a question for another lecture. I don't want to fill your minds with poetry about imagination and exploration, why we must explore when we have so many issues to deal with on Earth right now. What reason do we have to spend $1 on space over $1 fighting climate change, or improving school districts, or feeding the hungry and housing the homeless, or building better roads, or repairing bridges? And before going into that, I want to talk about the worldview that really frames the answers that I'm going to give. Basically, it starts with answering the idea that there isn't enough out there to support all the people in the world. That we'll keep talking and talking, taking and taking rather, until there's nothing left to take. And the best thing we could do is to stop growing. Just take stock and don't build more, don't do more, don't eat more. This might be fine for some of us, but it's not fine for the 3 billion or so people in this world that haven't gotten to live in the same resource-intensive life that many of us have had the luck of living in, and they aspire to it. The more of them enter the pool of consumers, the more we need to make. And the more we need to make, the less we have to go around. But we need to get ahead of that thought right now. This kind of short-sighted argument presumes a static state of technology. So let me ask you this, because what we're really talking about is overpopulation and technology here. If you have an island the size of Texas, totally isolated with one person on it, and no food, no water, nothing for the entire island, what do you call that? That is called overpopulation. You're right, because the carrying capacity of this Texas-sized island is effectively zero. It can't support any people, and yet there is one. So our sad resident will die pretty quickly, it seems. Now you have a sunny little island with 100 people on it. They have invented on the bottom a solar-powered technology to desalinate the water, so make fresh water out of salt water. They have vertical farms that save space where they can grow more than enough food to eat. They even have a bunch of chickens they can get essential proteins from. The 100 people eat 3 square meals a day, and even though they live close to each other, that's more than enough food to go around. Is that island technically overpopulated? The answer is no. The population could grow, they'd still have enough. So we're left with an important conclusion here. Technology is at the core of human survival. If we have better technology, we don't need to remain beholden to the amount of resources available to us. We can create the means for our own survival. And this leads me to the real reason why we explore, and that is, say it with me, necessity is the mother of invention. Very few things explain this better than the picture you see on the bottom right. I'm guessing maybe one or two of you know what we're looking at. In case you don't, these are ladies in the 60s sewing in strands of memory into tiny rings in the Apollo command module. Seriously, zeros and ones were represented by whether or not a hair-sized copper strand went through the inside or outside of a ring of metal. That was used to create Apollo's memory modules. There are hundreds of thousands of these things woven together by the memory weavers to create all of the digital commands that were used to control the Apollo flight computers. And that, importantly, is also where RAM, or random access memory, comes from. So what's the point then? The point is, we didn't need to go to the moon. It was a manufactured necessity born of geopolitical race between the superpowers at the time, the USA, the USSR. So we didn't go to stay, we didn't create lunar bases, we didn't mine resources, we didn't create a thriving research outpost. We went just to go and dumped hundreds of billions of dollars into the endeavor along the way. I admit that. It was what you might call a manufactured necessity. And boy, did we get some really important inventions that changed the course of human history out of that. Because of RAM, we have computers, you have cell phones. Because of other inventions, we have GPS. And just as you can track your Uber, a farmer can track the rains and decide if and when to plant. We can track seasonal shifts in weather. Because of our investments on the fringe of the possible, we can make our lives on Earth today better. That's why we explore. That's why we invest money in this stuff. So more than anything, putting our minds to a big, hard problem challenges us to invent in ways that help overcome long time horizons. And we get so many cool inventions out of that improve life for all people. I've already mentioned GPS. I've already mentioned phones and the internet. Kevlar also comes from the space race, and thousands of other really fascinating inventions along the way. And now you're probably wondering where I fit in all of this. This is what I do and why. My job is pretty niche, and sometimes they don't love me a lot, because sometimes I'm a lot better at finding ways to spend money than I am at finding ways to make it. But here's the thing, we already talked a lot about the importance of long-term investment in order to secure the future. Profit and well-being can work together if your time horizons are aligned. What happens in the long term if we trash our planet to make a lot of money today or tomorrow? The problem is pretty simple. Everyone is poor and sad. We have to think ahead of time to what tomorrow's problems are going to be, start solving them today, and create inventions along the way. And that's really what my job means. Infrastructure is really a fixed capital asset that increases revenue potential by creating a multiple for other assets, either helping them function more efficiently or fully enabling them. Basically, that means I work on space stations, either crewed or uncrewed, humans or robots, because I'm interested in creating value for the scientists, for the researchers, for the astronauts, that are going to be using them, creating those extraordinary inventions, imagining that future, and doing things that I can't even possibly imagine. So that's my job. As to the problem of finding new markets, it's a problem from hell, because we're really building the plane as we're flying it. Space in some ways is a solution in search of a problem. That's what I'm trying to prevent. It's cool to spend money on the sci-fi future. It really is, but resources are limited, and we have to steward them well, in part because we've got a lot of things to solve, in part because it's really hard to convince people that have a lot on their mind that basic research is important. But it's been the only thing keeping our civilization moving forward since the first caveman bonked 2 stones together to see what would happen and discovered fire. So we got to make it profitable. We got to make it useful for someone. That's the challenge of this space world, because capital has super short time horizons. Investors don't think very, very far ahead. So how do we think that far in advance and make generational investments? The same question goes for renewable energy investment, by the way. Same question goes for the things that made the Apollo missions and your cell phones possible. The worst thing is, when someone does come up with a revolutionary new technology, more often than not, they're laughed out of the room. If you're old like me, you remember how many jokes there were about the first iPhones. If you're way older, you'll remember the insane advertisements that were being plastered all over cities by the whale oil lobbies, telling people that electricity would surely kill them all. That's that picture there in the middle, and we should just stick to candles. At the same time, GPS, a military investment with no possible commercial utility, right, now helps you get home at the click of a button by hailing a cab, telling a cab exactly where you are. Very rarely can you predict where advances and markets like this will come from? But for some of us, like me, that's our job. My job is to do that, but for space technology, for space infrastructure, and encourage capitalists, encourage investors, and encourage governments to invest in a way that benefits all people. That is a very hard job, because money talks, and I have to make sure that all of those interests are aligned for the benefit of all humankind. So how you get involved? I mean, man, there are so many ways. First, I would encourage you to remember that STEM is a great path: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. But that's not the only one. So keep doing what you love, and go from there. If you're interested in the space industry, I'm obviously always happy to talk. But there are many paths. There are artists. There are writers, there are journalists and thinkers, and social scientists studying the way that humans react to being isolated for long periods of time. There's so much that you can provide. Of course, there's finance, there's accounting, there's business management. This is really an industry at the very beginning. It is a wild frontier. Anything goes, and everyone's just kind of trying to figure out what works and where those next big steps lie, and you really can do it. It is a very open place to work. So stick with what interests you. Don't feel the need to immediately change. Do it well, and definitely don't stop trying. I didn't mean to move that far in advance. But you can work on Earth observation on the left. You can work on projects on lunar regolith, lunar soil, and there in the middle. You can go out to Mars and see see sunsets on another world, or you can work in astronomy, and if you're really interested in the hard science of the field, on the right you see a picture of the first black hole that was directly imaged. I mean, even in the space industry, it's not just one thing, right? That's the point here. It's many things at once. So many ways to get involved, many fields of interest that you could get involved with. A final thought here. This is the one time I'll get misty-eyed with you guys. This has been a really I think I hope I haven't discouraged anyone. It is tough. There are a lot of problems. It's going to take a lot of money. We know that. We need people to help solve these problems. But just remember, what the scales we're working with are. A picture in front of you from Saturn, taken by the Cassini probe. That little pixel there contains everyone you've ever loved, everything you've ever done, every belief, every single bit of life and lived experience that we know exists. It is in that dot. That dot is Earth, looked at from Saturn. There is so much to learn and know in space. As I said at the beginning, it is everything other than Earth that has and will ever exist. By going up, we remember much better where we came from. We remember what makes life on Earth so special, what makes it so easy compared to living in space, and hopefully by becoming a spacefaring civilization, we learn the preciousness of life on Earth, how to make it more livable for everyone, and we come out with the innovations, the new economies, the new business models that can help that life, make that life better for all of us. And I think that's really special. So with that, I'm done. Love to take any questions if there are. I've got plenty of time. So I give it back to you, Liliana.
Adrian, thank you so much for your presentation. I think my students got a lot of ideas for their projects, their final projects. But before they are going to ask questions, I would like people from the audience, which are on Zoom, to ask their question if they have. So Alberto, I saw that you were writing something in the chat. Do you have any questions? If you can unmute yourself and can ask.
Yes, thank you for your talk, Adrian. Excellent. It's the first time I hear something more on the reality of economics and technical feasibility. Thank you. So one of the questions I had was the space tourism and the space companies, private companies that are working on sending millionaires and all that. I see that they really don't fly, or they don't reach high enough altitude has to avoid the problem of re-entry and burning the equipment. Right. So is that part of the reason that makes it more feasible for them to do it?
That is an excellent question. Thank you for asking, Alberto. So yes, yes and no. Those are called ballistic trajectories, ballistic flights for everyone. So they don't reach a speed for everybody in the audience. They don't reach a speed going up high enough that when they come back down into Earth's atmosphere, that atmosphere that we already talked about being so difficult to get through causes friction and heats up the spacecraft to make it burn. That problem of re-entry is a big part of the reason of why going to the moon, going to other planets and coming back is so darn hard. That causes a lot of technical requirements to be foisted on the spacecraft. So when you have more technical requirements, you have more expense. When you have more expense, the tickets become more expensive. It becomes a bigger investment. The risk is a lot higher when you're coming in at 17,000, 18,000 kilometers an hour and everything around you is burning and you have to stay alive and your parachutes have to work perfectly when you land in the ocean. You are very correct that the companies doing those parabolic flights up to just over 62 kilometers, sometimes as high as 100 kilometers, just over 100 kilometers. You're correct in that those companies have vastly reduced system requirements on their spacecraft. They do not need to put in like a heat shield, like a thermal control mechanisms, things to keep the astronauts from literally boiling on their way back down to Earth. I'll also add that typical re-entry times, so that is when you're on orbit going around the Earth and you have to go much faster than you would on a parabolic trajectory, going just up and back down. When you're in orbit, you're going super, super fast. But because your angle has to be pretty shallow coming into the Earth's atmosphere, so you burn up a lot slower and a lot cooler. You're not burning up way too hot by going straight down very fast. And you're using some of that atmosphere to slow you down in the process. That process, because you have to take it so shallow, can sometimes last as long as 15 minutes. So that's really like 15 minutes of terror for those astronauts. They're out of communication with Earth. They're, you know, all they see in the windows is fire. The temperature in the cabin is rising. And there's a lot of danger in that period. So you are absolutely correct. The reason that they're able to send up tourists on those flights is because they can keep them from having to go through that really dangerous reentry. I will say that SpaceX in the Inspiration 4 mission did actually send 4 astronauts, 4 civilians up to orbit for 3 days, and they did have to re-enter. But SpaceX has already perfected their heat shield technology that it uses on the International Space Station to send up astronauts up to the ISS. So they already have that technology. Granted, they were very expensive tickets, very expensive. So the difference in between the price of a ticket on one of those parabolic flights is about $500,000 compared to about $55 million. So that gives you some idea of the difference in what it takes, hopefully.
Other questions? James, do you have a question? Yes, James.
Yeah, I'm completely sold on this idea you have of we need, you know, space flight is going to give us all sorts of returns on things that we don't even know about. But I'm having a hard time plugging in how this capitalistic investment works. So if I put in, you know, $100 to whatever you're doing, and okay, a tachyon beam gets invented. I saw one of those on Star Trek once. How does that ever come back to me? I think my $100 just still disappears and somebody else benefits from that tachyon beam. So I'm not seeing how the capitalistic economics works.
James, I mean, like chef's kiss, man. You and me both sometimes, and that's really that's the central challenge. Because in the history of history and civilization, when it takes that much money and that much time, and we all agree we need this thing to make the world a better place, to make civilization livable, to make money in the long term, it's typically been big coalitions of coordinated action, aka governments, not always, but usually governments that step in to make those initial investments. And then the capitalists take over and they say, aha, there's a way that we could use those roads. Aha, there's a way that we could use that GPS. Now, as I said, governments happen to be stupendously bad at actually tracking the returns on those decadal, generational investments. I mean, how are you going to say, like, you know, X number of rest stops were built and gas stations were built along this stretch of highway, so over time the highway has generated Y number of dollars? That is very difficult. I think as an economist, we could find some vectors that, or some like comparables, and we could say, okay, like maybe over 10 years, you know, there was a growth in these economies that was, you know, A, B, or C percentage higher than, you know, places 100 miles away. And that's probably accountable to the highway bringing people through and, you know, bringing up commerce. But, you know, let's say I get to a meeting in New York because I drove a day faster than I would had I, or a week faster than had I taken a horse and buggy. How are you going to mark the fact that I was able to sign that business deal in New York? How are you going to put that down to the investment in the highway? You can't do it. So you're asking a really excellent question, and it is very tough. I'm serious, you know, I'm not like, hey, you know, I like making money. I like it when my company makes money, but dealing with capitalist economics when you are investing in infrastructure is extremely difficult. And that's why we have to be very judicious about how we present the benefits of what we're doing. And that's why we have to be very judicious about selecting the right kinds of investors. Now, I assure you, the right kinds of investors are out there. And they're out there because people like me have worked with the space station program for, you know, dozens of years. We understand what the space station program can do. We understand the market really well, and we've spent our entire careers basically doing all of that math that I just talked about doing on highways, right? And making sure that I'm able to account for how and to whom benefits accrue. And I'm able to say, like, listen, it's an analogy, right? Think of us as mall builders. You know, I basically, my life has lived in analogies like that, right? I'm building a mall in space, and I'm just the landlord, and I'm going to sell, you know, one store to company X and one store to company Y, and they're going to build this research equipment, and they're going to have customers, but they're going to pay me rent just like in a mall on Earth. And everyone's like, oh yeah, space malls, I get it. Even though the story is wildly more complicated, more difficult than that. But it's really through that, like, analogizing that we really have to communicate benefits to investors to get them smart about why they should put in their money, not for 1 year, not for 5 years, but for 10 to 20 to 30 years at a time, and get investments back in the very long term. So there are actually investment mechanisms that are really, really good. One of which, and I don't want to bore the audience kind of with the details here, but one of which is infrastructure or institutional infrastructure investment. And they've financed major projects like, you know, the channel between England and France going, you know, under the English Channel. They've financed big bridge projects, and you know, they're the ones that collect the tolls when you put up toll booths across a bridge, right? Those investments do pay off. They pay off in the long term, but they pay off extraordinarily well if you're the one collecting the tolls. So we want to be the ones collecting the tolls. That's kind of the business pitch in a very, very reduced nutshell. But in short, you're right. There's a lot of incompatibility, and we have to be very careful about how we present the argument.
Do other people in the audience have questions? If you do, please unmute yourself and ask. If not, I will let my students ask questions. It seems that nobody wants to ask questions. So from our students, who wants to come first? Just come in.
Hello, sir. My name is Jacob Bowers, and I've got to say, I really do appreciate you taking the time to have this talk. And I have to say, I absolutely agree with the idea of we need to be focusing on infrastructure. That's just something that I personally believe in. And to kind of pick your brain for a moment, what sort of things do you think that a real space station that we should be focusing on, such as in particular location, like uses such as like refueling, and then how do we break even with the cost?
Do you want a book? Or what do you ask?
Whatever you're willing to say is perfectly fine.
No, great. So what should we be focusing on? I would say that the first thing I want to say is something called ECLSS. That is ECLSS, Environmental Control and Life Support Systems. ECLSS drives everything in space. As I said, right, if you know, it is very hard to maintain. You have to bring up oxygen, you have to bring up water. Entropy will always win. So the more, so what's called closed loop, the more we can close the loop of ECLSS, meaning we don't have to bring in extra water, we don't have to bring in extra oxygen, we can recycle everything, right? From the CO2, it's CO2, right? That means that there's oxygen being breathed out, we have to recycle that, right? There's water in some pretty unpleasant places, right? Waste products. We can get that water back and have it actually be extremely pure, much more pure than the water you get out of your tap, more pure even than the water you can get and buy purified at a store through reverse osmosis, right? So that I think is probably the #1 challenge today, really closing the ECLSS loop. If we can invest more in that, I think staying up on orbit will get a lot cheaper and frankly, a lot safer. The fewer repairs we have to do, the more astronaut time we can liberate to doing things like science, to doing things like, I don't know, looking out the window and writing a poem to inspire a generation. Like, that's pretty cool too, right? That's an important part of space travel. But you can't do that if you're always worried about your CO2 scrubbers, right? So that's kind of, I hope, a very direct answer to your first question. There are many answers, but I think that's the best one. As to how we close the business case, that is literally taking up 99% of my brain power on a daily basis. It's an extremely tough question. Bankers are always breathing down my neck. It is constant. But what I would say in short is there are a lot of countries out there with the means, but not the access, means to pay for, but not the access to space. So actually building up a space program is really flipping hard. You need facilities, you need technology, you need scientists, you need all of this infrastructure that in the United States we've built up since the days of before Apollo, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo. In the UK or in France or all across the European Union, and now in China, in India, in Russia, we've built up this infrastructure of capability. But there are still hundreds of other countries on Earth that don't have the money and don't have the time to build that capability up themselves. They might not want to. But what they do want is to benefit from all of the cool stuff that comes with an astronaut program. All of the things that you learn, all of the knowledge that you gain, all of the inspiration that you can, provide students in your country. A great example of this is the fact that my old company called Nanarax, we managed the science mission of the first United Arab Emirates, the first Emirati astronaut to go to space. Now, the UAE isn't part of the ISS program. They don't pay the dues like NASA, like the European Space Agency, like the Japanese or the Russians. They don't pay to be on the ISS. That is an international program. It doesn't include the UAE. So the guy essentially went up there as a tourist, but he wasn't a tourist. He was a sovereign astronaut from a separate nation. Now, what was so cool is we actually got to design an entire science program for him to do for the 2 weeks that he was up there. And one of the things that we did was we went to students all across the UAE and we did a science competition. And they sent up 2 experiments. They sent up the 2 winning experiments that he got to do while he was up there was fermenting camel milk. I mean, that's a very UAE problem to have. So like camel milk's a thing. They wanted to see what would happen if you fermented it on orbit. And, it's good for, understanding the mechanics of what, organic liquids do on orbit. Very useful to them. And the other one was germinating a date palm seed. And the date palm is a revered plant in the UAE. It was revered by the founding king. So that happened to be a really inspirational mission for the country. And they've now decided to kick off a space science program. They're making massive investments, inspiring a generation, bringing more people into the STEM field, educating their population, focusing on young women, which I think is really important. And they're using our company in large part to do that. And so what we've done effectively is in the future, we hope to fly a UAE astronaut. That is an expensive mission. That is in the high tens of millions of dollars. But for now, it is the only way, and doing multiple of those by managing their science programs, by making space science more attractive to them. It is the way that we really bring these countries to the table and say, here's a new space station. Here's what it's going to cost. You get all of the benefits of an astronaut program, none of the headache that is associated with all the investments you have to make to actually truly have your own. And you can still get the science back, still inspire your people. And that's the best thing, that we can really do. And by scaling that, by doing that more often, by having more missions like that, I think we stand a really, really good chance of closing the massive investments that we'll have to make in this big piece of infrastructure. So I hope that answers your questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
So we have one more student asking a question, and I think this is going to be the last one. Please come.
Right.
Hello, I'm Isaac Weddington. I'm studying political science and law, so I am especially concerned with issues of tragedies of the commons. Mainly wondering what kind of cooperation, oversight, or regulation is going on to prevent clutter of the lower orbits and making sure that we can keep doing space flight, even if it's no longer overseen by governments. So.
Great. It's terrible. We need you. Keep studying tragedies of the commons. Become a space lawyer. It is a really tough problem. I didn't even begin to address orbital debris, orbital cluttering. That is such an important problem. There are really cool companies like my friends at Astroscale. I would highly recommend looking them up. They're really cool companies working on the problem right now. There are a number of proposed solutions. Obviously, solution number one, don't make the mess in the first place. So I find it ludicrous that countries are testing explosive weapons on orbit and cluttering debris and creating cluttering debris that endangers our astronauts and their astronauts too, by the way, all of our satellite infrastructure, and generally makes it harder to get to orbit for everyone. That is like the pinnacle of stupidity, and it needs to stop. And we need international consequences in place to make it stop. But as you know, tragedy of the commons and coordination problems, the UN is great, but it's really bad at affecting consequences. And so the countries that have tested weapons on orbit and created orbital debris have not been punished for that and have not been discouraged from doing it again, other than the fact that they're really just making it hard for themselves to keep going to space. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is smarter policy. Smarter policy, take for instance, what the US military does with the 25-year life limitation of any satellite. So if you want to launch a US government satellite, or you want to get paid by the US government to launch your thing, you have to effectively guarantee that your satellite, after being safed or turned off or reaching the end of its usable life, will either naturally deorbit in 25 years. So that means that its orbit will degrade up to the point that it burns up in the atmosphere and doesn't create more clutter on orbit, or otherwise propulsively deorbit, which means that after it's at the end of its life, it fires off its thrusters and re-enters the Earth's atmosphere and burns up. And it has to do that within a certain time frame. But this isn't a law, right? If you are a private company that sends up your satellite and you do it for yourself and you don't get funding from the government, you don't really have to meet that standard. I mean, many companies do, most companies do, don't get me wrong, but it is not a law that they do. So I think our system of regulations and incentives really needs to evolve in order to account for that really big problem. Number three, yeah, again, going back to my friends at Astroscale, you can clean up the mess, but here's the problem: who's going to pay you? Unless the government recognizes the need to clean up the mess and creates incentives for people to go and clean it up, they're not going to do it out of the goodness of their own heart. They don't have the money. Each mission costs tens of millions of dollars. And companies don't have that kind of money to invest in being good Samaritans. So who's going to do it? We could get really creative with insurance schemes and laws that say, you know, if, for instance, you are sending up a satellite, you have to pay a 0.5% fee in your insurance, built into your insurance, that goes into a pool. That essentially, if you're not able to deorbit, fine, government will do it for you, and it will dig into that pool to pay a company like our friends at Astroscale to bring down the debris that's generated. That's another pretty intelligent way of doing it, and it actually mirrors a lot of what we do on Earth today. And by the way, doesn't actually create disincentives to doing business that are that scary or that bad. It just means that we can continue doing business in the same way in this place, and somebody's going to clean up our mess. That's fine. And in my condo fees, I pay for somebody to pick up the trash. I'm really glad I don't have to walk out the door in, you know, a mountain of trash. I'm glad somebody picks it up for me. So in the same way, tragedy of the commons, but if we're able to explain the value of the commons to people, I think we'll have a lot better chance of getting them to account for the negative externalities of behaving irresponsibly on orbit and creating debris. So in summary, you know, a better a better regulatory framework that is able to account for potential of creating debris and better incentives around that, a complete ban on any weapons testing or overt creation of debris, and then a lot more an interesting technology to clean the debris that does exist to clean that up. But you are right, it is a problem. It's very, very dangerous because it's moving extremely fast. And it's totally unsustainable in the very near term. So we got to be careful and smart.
Yes. Adrian, thank you so much for your presentation. I think you gave my students lots of ideas about their project, and the other people from audience, I'm sure that they enjoy also your talk. Thank you very much, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Of course, guys, the pleasure is mine.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye now.